December 7, 1941, the date that would live in infamy, marked more than just the beginning of America's entry into World War II. As Japanese aircraft screamed over Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard his flagship, confident that his nation's naval superiority would remain unchallenged for years to come. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the largest battleships ever constructed, battle-hardened crews from campaigns in China, and a tactical doctrine refined through decades of preparation. What neither Yamamoto nor his colleagues anticipated was that their greatest enemy would not be American carriers or battleships, but rather a weapon they had repeatedly dismissed as primitive and ineffective: the American torpedo. The story begins not with explosions and sinking ships, but with bureaucratic arrogance and technological hubris. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese naval observers stationed in the United States regularly filed reports about American torpedo development. These documents, now preserved in the National Archives, reveal a consistent pattern of dismissiveness. Japanese engineers scoffed at the American Mark 14 torpedo, noting its frequent malfunctions during test runs and its apparent inability to detonate properly against target hulls. What they failed to recognize was that American engineers were meticulously documenting every failure, building a comprehensive database of problems that would eventually lead to revolutionary improvements. The Japanese Navy's own Long Lance torpedo represented the pinnacle of interwar naval technology. Powered by pure oxygen rather than compressed air, it could travel 49,000 yards at 48 knots, nearly twice the range of any American equivalent. Japanese torpedo officer S trained relentlessly, perfecting night attack techniques that would devastate Allied forces in the early Pacific battles. This technological and tactical superiority bred a dangerous complacency within the Imperial Naval Staff. Why concern themselves with American torpedo improvements when their own weapons were demonstrably superior? Meanwhile, beneath the bureaucratic surface at the United States Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, a quiet revolution was underway. Commander Charles Lockwood, who would later become commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, had been raising alarm bells about torpedo deficiencies since 1938. His reports documented magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely, depth mechanisms that ran deeper than set, and contact exploders that failed to fire upon impact. According to naval historian Clay Blair's work, Silent Victory, these problems stemmed from inadequate testing driven by peacetime budget constraints and institutional resistance to admitting design flaws. The Japanese intelligence apparatus, despite its sophistication, failed to track these American efforts at self-correction. Their agents focused on counting ships, monitoring fleet movements, and assessing industrial capacity. They did not comprehend that the Americans possessed something far more valuable than superior numbers: a cultural willingness to acknowledge failure and systematically eliminate its causes. This blind spot would prove catastrophic. As war clouds gathered over the Pacific in 1941, two naval powers prepared for confrontation with radically different approaches to technological development, one resting on proven superiority, the other desperately racing to fix fundamental flaws before battle would expose them. June 4, 1942, brought the turning point at Midway. But beneath the waves, American submariners were fighting a different, frustrating war. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton aboard USS Wahoo exemplified the growing rage within the submarine force. His patrol reports, preserved at the Naval History and Heritage Command, describe attack after attack WW. Here, torpedoes either ran beneath targets, exploded prematurely, or struck Japanese hulls with sickening thuds before sinking harmlessly into the depths. Morton's fury leaped from the page as he documented firing perfect spreads at stationary targets, merchant ships that should have been sitting ducks, only to watch them sail away unscathed while his torpedoes wasted away in the water. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, interpreted these failures as validation of their pre-war assessments. Intelligence reports flowing back to Tokyo described American submarines as ineffective, poorly commanded, and equipped with inferior weapons. Imperial Naval Headquarters congratulated themselves on their accurate pre-war intelligence gathering. Staff officers compiled statistics showing that despite America's larger submarine fleet, Japanese merchant tonnage losses remained manageable, The convoy system implemented by the Japanese seemed adequate. Their naval architects saw no reason to divert resources toward improved anti-submarine warfare measures. The Americans, they concluded, simply lacked the warrior spirit and technological sophistication to threaten Japan's maritime lifelines. This Japanese complacency stood in stark contrast to the mounting crisis within the American submarine command. By mid-1942, submarine skippers were openly rebelling against the Bureau of Ordnance, the organization responsible for torpedo development and testing. Commander Howard Gilmore of USS Growler conducted his own unauthorized tests, firing torpedoes against cliffs in the Aleutian Islands to observe detonation patterns. His findings, that contact exploders were crushing upon impact rather than detonating, were dismissed by Bureau officials as operationally inconclusive. The bureaucratic resistance to admitting design flaws had become so entrenched that field commanders began violating regulations to prove what everyone beneath the waves already knew. Their primary weapon was fundamentally broken. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, found himself caught between his frustrated submarine commanders and the defensive bureaucrats at the Bureau of Ordnance. Documents from the Admiral Nimitz Museum reveal his careful political maneuvering to force torpedo testing without directly challenging the Bureau's authority. He authorized tactical evaluations conducted by submarine squadron commanders in Hawaii, knowing these would document problems the Bureau could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Japanese merchant captains continued their runs throughout the Pacific, their ships laden with oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and food from Indochina, all the resources Japan needed to sustain its war machine. The turning point began in June 1943, when Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, newly appointed as Commander Submarine Force Pacific, decided to bypass Washington entirely. He established his own testing facility at Pearl Harbor, using captured Japanese depth charges AE and careful analysis of dewed torpedo recovery operations. His team discovered that the Mark 14 torpedo's magnetic exploder was triggering an Earth's magnetic field variations, causing premature detonations. More damning still, the contact exploder's firing pin was too light, crushing upon impact with armored hulls instead of triggering the detonator. September 1943 marked the moment American submariners finally received permission to deactivate their torpedoes' magnetic exploders. The change seemed minor, a simple adjustment to firing protocols, but its effects rippled across the Pacific like a tsunami. Lieutenant Ender Richard O'Kane aboard USS Tang reported immediate improvements during his October patrol. His war diary, cited in accounts preserved by the Submarine Force Library and Museum, described sinking 5 Japanese merchant ships in a single night engagement, each torpedo running true and detonating with devastating effect. After nearly 2 years of frustration, American submarines had become the lethal weapons their designers had originally intended. The Japanese Navy's intelligence apparatus detected the shift, but fatally misinterpreted its significance. Reports reaching Tokyo in late 1943 acknowledged increased merchant shipping losses, but attributed them to improved American tactics rather than technological fixes. Imperial Naval Headquarters remained fixated on the dramatic carrier battles that captured public attention: the Coral Sea Midway, the Philippine Sea. The unglamorous war of attrition being waged by submarines against Japan's merchant marine received insufficient attention from strategists who still believed battleships and carriers would determine the war's outcome. This institutional blindness prevented Japan from implementing defensive measures that might have mitigated the approaching catastrophe. By January 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The statistics compiled by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee tell a brutal story. 300,000 tons sunk in January alone, followed by 400,000 in February, and climbing steadily thereafter. Each tanker sent to the bottom meant less fuel for Japanese aircraft. Every transport sunk meant fewer supplies reaching isolated garrisons, and every loss compounded the empire's growing resource crisis. Japan's war economy, which depended on a vast maritime supply network stretching from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies, was bleeding to death through 1,000 underwater cuts. The American torpedo improvements continued beyond simply fixing the magnetic exploder. engineers at Newport developed new contact exploder designs with heavier firing pins that detonated reliably against both armored warships and thin-hulled merchants. They improved depth key, ping mechanisms, ensuring torpedoes ran at their set depths rather than passing harmlessly beneath targets. Most critically, they increased production dramatically. By mid-1944, American factories were producing more torpedoes in a month than they had in an entire year before the war. Japanese industry, strangled by the very blockade these torpedoes enabled, could not hope to match this output. Admiral Lockwood's submarine force had evolved into a precisely coordinated hunting machine. Wolf packs of 3 or 4 submarines worked together, sharing intelligence via radio and coordinating attacks on Japanese convoys. The Americans had cracked Japanese naval codes, allowing them to position submarines along predicted convoy routes. Japanese convoy escorts, designed primarily for surface threats, proved woefully inadequate against coordinated sub-EM Orion attacks. The destroyers and escort vessels Japan did possess were increasingly diverted to garrison supply runs as the Americans island-hopped across the Pacific, leaving merchant convoys vulnerable to submarine predation that grew more efficient with each passing month as American torpedo technology reached maturity and tactical doctrine evolved to exploit it fully. April 19, 1944, witnessed the sinking of the Japanese aircraft carrier Taiho during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, struck by a single torpedo from USS Albacore that triggered catastrophic aviation fuel explosions. While this dramatic loss captured headlines, a quieter catastrophe was unfolding across Japan's maritime supply lines. That same month, American submarines sank 350,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping, effectively destroying Japan's ability to maintain its economic lifelines to conquered territories. The improved American torpedoes, once dismissed by Japanese naval observers as primitive and unreliable, were now performing with devastating consistency, running true to their targets and detonating with reliable violence against hulls that once seemed immune to American underwater weapons. The Japanese Maritime Escort Command, established belatedly in November 1943, struggled desperately to stem the hemorrhaging of merchant tonnage. Grand Escort Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Koshiro Oikawa implemented convoy systems, established patrol zones, and requisitioned destroyers for escort duty. According to research compiled by the Naval War College, these measures proved woefully insufficient against the swarm of American submarines now prowling Japanese waters. The escort vessels themselves became targets. Their destruction removed what little protection remained for merchant ships. By summer 1944, Japanese merchant captains increasingly refused convoy assignments, recognizing that gathered ships simply presented concentrated targets for American wolfpacks rather than providing mutual protection against submarines whose torpedoes now worked as designed. The economic consequences cascaded through Japan's war machine with accelerating momentum. The oil refineries of the Dutch East Indies, captured at great cost in 1942, might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did Japan by late 1944. Tankers laden with crude oil for Japan's industrial heartland became priority targets for American submarines. Of the 44 tankers that departed from Southeast Asian ports in August 1944, only 14 reached Japanese ports intact. The remainder rested on the Pacific floor, sent by Mark 14 torpedoes that now functioned exactly as their designers had intended. Japan's aircraft production continued, but mounting aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Training programs collapsed as fuel rationing meant student pilots received barely sufficient flight hours before combat deployment. Food supplies became equally critical. Japan's home islands could not feed their population without massive rice imports from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. The American submarine campaign transformed these supply routes into gauntlets of death. Transport ships carrying rice from Saigon to Yokohama made increasingly desperate runs, their captains knowing that American submarines waited along every probable route. The Japanese Navy attempted to disguise transport ships as hospital vessels, a violation of international law born from desperation, but American codebreakers identified these deceptions through intercepted communications. By autumn 1944, rice stocks in major Japanese cities had fallen to crisis levels. forcing the government to implement draconian rationing programs that bred civilian discontent and undermined morale at precisely the moment Japan needed unity in the face of approaching defeat. The Imperial Navy's response to this catastrophe remained hamstrung by institutional rigidity and resource scarcity. Japanese shipyards, lacking the steel that submarines prevented from reaching the home islands, could not build replacement merchant vessels at rates approaching American submarine kill rates. Anti-submarine warfare technology lagged far behind American developments. Japanese depth charges remained inadequate, sonar systems primitive, and tactical doctrine outdated. Most critically, the institutional assumptio, and that had dominated Japanese naval thinking since before the war, that American technology was inferior and American fighting spirit inadequate, had become so entrenched that even mounting evidence of catastrophic merchant losses could not shake the conviction among senior officers that decisive surface engagement would determine the war's outcome, a delusion the improved American torpedo campaign was systematically destroying. October 24, 1944, brought the largest naval battle in history as American and Japanese fleets collided in the Philippine Sea during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The dramatic surface engagement, battleships exchanging broadsides, carriers launching strikes, destroyers making torpedo runs, captured the world's attention and represented the last gasp of traditional naval warfare. Yet beneath the waves, American submarines were prosecuting a different kind of battle that would ultimately prove more decisive. USS Darter and USS Dak ambushed Japanese Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force in Palawan Passage, sinking the heavy cruisers Atago and Maya with improved Mark 14 torpedoes that functioned flawlessly. Each torpedo struck home, detonated properly, and sent thousands of tons of Japanese warship to the bottom, a stark contrast to the frustrating failures of 1942. The psychological impact of reliable torpedoes on American submarine crews cannot be overstated. Commander George Grider, who served on multiple war patrols, later wrote accounts describing how the torpedo improvements transformed submarine service from an exercise in frustration to a hunt where skill and courage produced tangible results. Skippers who had once approached attacks with gnawing uncertainty about their weapons now pressed attacks with aggressive confidence. The moral calculus of submarine warfare, the deliberate sinking of merchant ships and the inevitable deaths of civilian sailors, became easier to accept when torpedoes reliably performed their lethal function rather than wasting opportunities through mechanical failure. This psychological shift translated into more aggressive patrolling, bolder attack positions, and higher Japanese casualties. Japanese naval construction priorities in 1944 revealed the empire's continued failure to recognize the submarine threat's true magnitude. According to post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey analyses, Japanese shipyards devoted resources to building battleships and fleet carriers, even as merchant tonnage losses mounted catastrophically. The super baddie, Layship Shinano, converted to a carrier before completion, represented resources that might have built dozens of convoy escorts or hundreds of anti-submarine patrol craft. This misallocation of scarce industrial capacity stemmed directly from pre-war assumptions about American torpedo inadequacy, assumptions that should have been revised by 1944 but remained embedded in institutional thinking among Japan's naval leadership hierarchy. The human cost of Japan's dismissal of American torpedo improvements became staggeringly apparent by year's end. Merchant marine casualties climbed into the tens of thousands as ship after ship disappeared beneath the waves. Unlike military personnel, merchant sailors received no glory, no public recognition, and often no official acknowledgement of their deaths. They simply vanished with their ships, victims of a campaign that remained largely invisible to the Japanese public. The government suppressed information about shipping losses, fearing civilian panic, but whispers spread through port cities as fewer ships returned, and more families received terse notifications that loved ones were missing at sea. This hidden catastrophe undermined Japan's war effort as efficiently as any battle loss while remaining largely absent from official records. By December 1944, Japan's situation had become mathematically unsustainable. American submarines had sunk over 3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping since Pearl Harbor, with the majority occurring after torpedo improvements made American submarines truly effective. The remaining Japanese merchant fleet numbered fewer than 1,000 ships capable of making the runs between the home islands and resource areas, insufficient to maintain even minimal imports. Oil stocks approached exhaustion, with strategic reserves dwindling towards zero, despite desperate conservation measures that grounded much of Japan's air force and kept most of the remaining surface fleet harbored to conserve fuel for a final decisive battle that would never come, because the submarines that Japanese observers had once dismissed were making that battle impossible. January 3, 1945 saw the Japanese super battleship Yamato, the most powerful warship ever constructed, sitting impotent in Cure Harbor because the Imperial Navy lacked fuel for operations. The ship's massive 18-inch guns, capable of hurling shells over 25 miles, meant nothing without the fuel oil to move the vessel into combat. This humiliating paralysis of Japan's premier warship symbolized the submarine campaign's success more eloquently than any statistics. American submarines, armed with torpedoes that Japanese engineers had dismissed as inferior only 4 years earlier, had accomplished what no surface fleet could achieve. They had effectively eliminated Japan's ability to wage war by severing its maritime supply lines. The blockade was complete, and Japan was suffocating. The American submarine force intensified operations as victory approached, hunting the few remaining Japanese vessels with relentless efficiency. Wolfpack tactics evolved to deadly perfection, with submarines coordinating attacks through radio communications that Japanese forces could intercept, but no longer effectively counter. Commander Richard O'Kane's USS Tang epitomized his aggressive final phase before its loss in October 1944, sinking 24 Japanese ships in 5 patrols, a record that stood as testament to both crew skill and reliable torpedo technology. Each American submarine skipper knew his weapons would perform as designed, eliminating the variable that had plagued operations in the campaign's early dark days when more than half of torpedoes fired failed to function properly. Japanese desperation manifested in increasingly futile defensive measures. The Navy requisitioned fishing boats for anti-submarine patrol. Armed with depth charges, these vessels lacked the speed and sonar capability to effectively deploy. Merchant ships received minimal armament and orders to zigzag constantly, measures that might have helped in 1942, but proved inadequate against the coordinated wolf packs of 1945. Some Japan East captains attempted to sail only during storms, when visibility and sea conditions might provide protection. But American submarines operated effectively in weather that would have strained earlier models. The technological gap that had once favored Japan had reversed completely, and no amount of tactical innovation could compensate for the fundamental inability to protect vulnerable merchant shipping against submarines that now possessed virtually complete tactical and technological superiority. The humanitarian consequences of the blockade grew increasingly severe as winter transitioned to spring in 1945. Japanese civilians, subject to rice rations that had declined to near starvation levels, began dying from malnutrition-related diseases. Urban populations suffered most acutely, as agricultural regions could sustain themselves while cities depended entirely on food shipments that submarines prevented from arriving. The Japanese government never publicly acknowledged the blockade's extent, maintaining fictional reports of adequate food supplies even as mortality statistics climbed and public health deteriorated. According to historical research cited by historians studying Japan's home front during this period, this combination of naval blockade and conventional bombing created conditions in Japanese cities that approached those in besieged medieval fortresses, populations trapped without adequate food, medicine, or hope of relief. The institutional failure of Japanese intelligence regarding American torpedo improvements revealed itself completely by March 1945, when staff officers reviewing casualty reports finally acknowledged the systematic nature of merchant shipping losses. Internal Imperial Navy documents, recovered during the post-war occupation, show staff discussions recognizing that American submarines had become the primary threat to Japan's survival. Conclusion reached 3 years too late to implement effective countermeasures. The destroyers Japan needed for convoy protection had been expended in surface battles. The aircraft Japan needed for anti-submarine patrol lacked fuel. The industrial capacity Japan needed to build new ships had been strangled by the very blockade it needed to break. The Japanese Navy found itself trapped in a circular problem, where each element of a solution required resources the submarine blockade had already denied, making resolution impossible through any measures available to commanders facing imminent defeat. April 7, 1945, marked the final sortie of battleship Yamato on a one-way suicide mission toward Okinawa, carrying only enough fuel for the outbound voyage. Fuel scraped together from reserves that could not be replenished because submarines had sunk the tankers. American aircraft destroyed Yamato before it reached its destination, but the super battleship's FA had already been sealed by the cumulative effects of the submarine campaign. The vessel's operational paralysis throughout 1944 and early 1945 represented a strategic victory for American submarines, more complete than any battle could have achieved. Japan's most powerful weapon had become an immobile monument to the success of a submarine force that Japanese observers had once confidently dismissed as technologically inferior and operationally incompetent. The statistical accounting of the submarine campaign revealed a catastrophe for Japan that dwarfed individual battle losses. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling nearly 5 million tons, roughly 60% of Japan's pre-war merchant fleet. Additionally, submarines sank over 200 warships, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. These achievements came at significant cost. 52 American submarines were lost with their crews, but the exchange ratio favored the Americans overwhelmingly. More significantly, the improved torpedo's role was fundamental. Post-war analysis indicated that early war sinkings would have been approximately 40% higher had torpedoes functioned properly from December 1941 onward, potentially shortening the war by 6 to 12 months and saving thousands of lives. Japanese post-war assessments, conducted under American occupation, reveal frank acknowledgement of catastrophic intelligence failures regarding American torpedo development. Admiral Somu Toyota, the final chief of the Navy General Staff, testified before occupation authorities that the Navy's pre-war intelligence apparatus had focused excessively on counting enemy ships while neglecting technological development trends. Japanese naval attachés in Washington during the 1930s had filed reports about American torpedo problems, but these reports fostered dangerous complacency rather than vigilance about potential improvements. The institutional assumption that Japanese technology was superior and American engineering inadequate prevented recognition that the Americans possessed something more valuable than current technological advantage: a systematic approach to identifying and correcting design flaws that would eventually produce weapons superior to Japan's supposedly unbeatable long-lance torpedo. The human dimension of this technological and institutional failure extends beyond casualty statistics into questions of strategic competence and institutional learning capacity. Japanese Navy officers received extensive education, often studying abroad at prestigious institutions. They understood naval warfare theory, ship design principles, and tactical doctrine. Yet this expertise failed to prevent catastrophic underestimation of American capacity for technological improvement. The failure was not one of intelligence gathering. Japanese agents accurately reported American torpedo problems, but rather intelligence analysis. The cognitive bias that led Japanese analysts to interpret American difficulties as evidence of permanent inferiority, rather than temporary obstacles, prevented the defensive preparations that might have mitigated the submarine campaign's worst effects. The torpedo improvement story illuminates broader patterns in technological competition during World War II. Germany and Japan both entered the war with locally superior technologies in various domains: tanks, aircraft, optics, propulsion systems. Both Axis powers assumed these advantages would persist throughout the conflict. Neither adequately appreciated Allied capacity for rapid development and mass production. The American approach to the torpedo problem: acknowledge failures, test rigorously, implement fixes, and scale production dramatically, represented a methodology applicable across military technology domains. By war's end, American forces wielded superior equipment in almost every category, from radar to proximity fuses to atomic weapons. The torpedo story was just one example of a systematic American advantage. The institutional capacity to learn, adapt, and improve faster than enemies who relied on initial superiority that eroded under the pressure of methodical American engineering. August 15, 1945, brought Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing Japan's surrender, his thin voice crackling across a nation that had been systematically strangled by forces its leaders never adequately prepared to counter. Among the many factors contributing to Japan's defeat, strategic overextension, industrial inferiority, code-breaking, and atomic weapons, the American submarine campaign enabled by improved torpedoes deserves recognition as perhaps the most decisive single element. The campaign was cumulative rather than dramatic, grinding rather than spectacular, but its effects were inescapable. By August 1945, Japan simply could not continue fighting because the nation lacked the physical resources to sustain military operations, civilian population needs, and industrial production simultaneously. American submarines had ensured this material exhaustion by making Japan's maritime supply lines unusable through the systematic application of torpedoes that finally worked as designed. The institutional lessons from Japan's dismissal of American torpedo improvements resonated through post-war military thinking across multiple nations. The story became a cautionary tale taught at naval war colleges worldwide. Never assume an adversary's technological problems are permanent. Never dismiss an opponent's capacity for improvement, and never let institutional arrogance blind you to changing tactical realities. Soviet naval planners studied the Pacific submarine campaign intensively, drawing lessons that shaped their own submarine force development during the Cold War. American defense planners codified processes for rapid problem identification and correction, attempting to institutionalize the systematic approach that had transformed dysfunctional Mark 14 torpedoes into war-winning weapons through methodical testing, honest failure assessment, and aggressive implementation of solutions once problems were identified. The human cost of institutional failure to take American torpedo development seriously extended far beyond military casualties into civilian suffering that might have been mitigated by earlier recognition of the submarine threat. Had Japanese naval leadership in 1942 acknowledged the likelihood of American torpedo improvements and implemented robust convoy protection systems, merchant shipping losses might have been reduced significantly. Fewer ships sunk would have meant more food reaching cities, less starvation among civilians, and marginally better conditions during Japan's final year of desperate resistance. This counterfactual exercise reveals that intelligence failures rarely affect only military outcomes. They ripple through entire societies, visiting consequences upon populations far removed from strategic decision-making processes. The technical legacy of the torpedo improvement campaign influenced post-war weapons development in ways that extended beyond submarines. The systematic testing protocols developed at Pearl Harbor and Newport became models for evaluating other weapons systems. The institutional reforms that broke the Bureau of Ordnance's defensive resistance to acknowledging design flaws influenced how the United States military approached weapons testing during the Cold War. The Mark 14 torpedo's troubled development history became required reading for engineers working on subsequent weapons projects, a reminder that initial design inadequacy need not mean ultimate failure if institutions remain committed to honest assessment and aggressive problem-solving. This legacy perhaps represents the campaign's most enduring contribution, not the specific technical improvements to torpedo design, but the validation of methodical engineering approaches to weapon system development. The story of Japanese dismissal of American torpedo improvements ultimately transcends specific historical circumstances to illuminate timeless principles about technological competition, institutional learning, and the dangers of complacency. In 1941, Japanese confidence in their naval superiority rested on solid foundation. Their ships were better, their crews more experienced, and their torpedoes demonstrably superior. 4 years later, their navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Their merchant fleet existed only as tattered remnants, and their nation stood on the brink of invasion, starved into submission by submarines wielding torpedoes they had once dismissed as inadequate. The reversal occurred not through dramatic battle, but through unglamorous engineering work. testing, analysis, redesign, and persistent implementation of improvements. Japan's failure was not technological but institutional. The inability to recognize that an opponent's current weakness might become tomorrow's strength if that opponent possessed the systematic capacity for improvement that ultimately determined victory in the 20th century's most destructive conflict. The lesson endures. Dismiss your adversary's potential for improvement at your own peril, for today's inferior weapon may become tomorrow's instrument of your destruction.